In this video, we will integrate a headless CMS to our Next.js block application, and then we will use GraphQL to fetch the data for the application. We won't code the Next.js app from scratch, but we will actually use this application we created in the first part of this video series. If you missed the first part, you can watch it from somewhere up there or in the link in the description. Or you can do as I will do right now and just clone the starter app from GitHub. So let's get started by just cloning the repo and running it so we see how it works. So you can find the repo from my GitHub profile /tumetus/cookingwithtuomo, and let's clone it. So I'm gonna click here and here, then open up my terminal and then clone the repo. Great, I'm gonna change into that directory and open up Visual Studio Code. And then let's install all the dependencies and then run the application. Okay, so here is the application, and it's very basic blog with a couple of blog posts listed on the front page, and then if we click one open, it opens it up on a separate page and displays the content. So right now all the blog posts are coming from a single file located under the lib and posts.js, and it's this posts array inside here that holds all the blog posts right now. So what we want to do is actually get rid of this posts file and use a headless CMS instead. The headless CMS we will be using in this video is called DatoCMS. And I also want to say thank you to DatoCMS because they are sponsoring this video. Few words about DatoCMS before we get started. So DatoCMS is a headless CMS, and it's very user and developer friendly, as you will soon find out. And they also provide a GraphQL API for fetching data to our application. So it's pretty straightforward to integrate it with our Next.js application. When we are using DatoCMS, we can also use this structured text they offer to store our blog post content. There is a Notion-like editor that we can use to write our blog posts and include all kinds of rich text features such as text formatting and images, for example. Displaying the content is also super easy because they offer a React component that we can just pass the JSON we get from the GraphQL API, and the component does all the heavy lifting for us. But more on that later on this video when we are implementing the content for the blog post page. So here is a rough plan what we will do in this video. So we will first create a free account to DatoCMS. Then after that we will create some models and records to DatoCMS, and I will explain what these are when we are creating them. And what this step basically is, it is us setting up the CMS for us so that we can integrate it and fetch data from it with our application. And last, we will modify the blog application code to use the headless CMS instead of fetching the posts from the JS file. So let's get started by creating an account to DatoCMS, and you can do it from datocms.com, and up here we have try for free, and just fill in your information over here and sign up. Once you have signed up for your account, you will see this projects view, and from here let's click the new project, then blank project, and then just give a name for the project, and I'm gonna call it Cooking with Tuomo, then create project. It will appear in the projects list, and we can click it open, and from there let's just click enter project. So right now we are in our project dashboard view, so to say. So if we take a look at over here on the left, we have all kinds of settings, models, blocks library, some global settings, environments. We can set up some webhooks, the API tokens, and so on. So this kind of stuff you can find on the left hand side. And then up here we have Media, API Explorer, and Settings. So in the Media section we have all our media assets, and the API Explorer, this is something we will use quite a lot when creating this project. So this is the GraphQL API Explorer, so we can actually write our GraphQL queries inside here and then just copy paste them inside our application. So that's pretty cool. And then the settings page was this one. So what we want to do now is kind of define the schema or the database inside our CMS. And we can do this by defining the models for our project. So let's open up this read more about models link and take a look at what models are. So right here we can see that DatoCMS can be seen as an editor-friendly interface over a database. So the first step is to build the actual schema upon which users will generate the actual website content. And the models can be viewed as database tables. So when we are thinking about models, we can think of them as database tables. And as database tables, models also can have different kinds of fields. And you can think of these fields much like a column inside a database table. So right here you can see all the different kinds of fields or columns you can add for a model. So now that we have a better understanding what these models and fields are, let's jump back to the models page inside our project, and let's start by creating a new model. And when we are thinking of what models should we create, well, we can get a hint of it when we switch back to the code and check out the post data we have for the current posts. So I have the post.js file open, and right here we can see we have ID, title, publish date, author, cover image, excerpt, content, and slug. And out of these, I would say that this could be one model, so it would be like one table in a database. So it would probably be called like a blog post or an article. And then inside this article, we pretty much have the author field. I'd say that is something we would like to have the content editors define, or something we would want to define inside the Headless CMS as a whole. So I'd say that we need an author model also, so a table for all the authors, and then just the article model. So let's create those two models. Let's start with the author. So I have the add new model, then the name author, and it automatically generates the model ID over here. Then if we take a look at the additional settings, there are some options we can also define for this model, but right now we can leave them as default and just save the model. And we can see it appears up here. And then let's create the model for the blog post or the article. So I'm gonna click here and I'm gonna call it article. And then in the additional settings, right now we want to actually enable this one. So we want to enable draft/published system. And what this means is that we can actually save our articles as drafts and they are not published until we hit the publish button. So otherwise, if we didn't check this box over here, whenever we saved a new article, it would automatically be available from the GraphQL API. So that's all we need to change in here. So let's save the model. So now that we have our models ready, we still want to add some fields to them, as we would want to add columns to our database tables. So let's start with the author model and click the add new field. And basically all we need right now for the author is the name of the author. So I'm gonna add a text field and a single line string. I'm gonna name it as name, and then let's check the validations. So right here for the fields we can specify some validations, and for the name field of this author we want it to be required, so you can't save an author without a name, and we don't need to set any default values or any presentation stuff. So let's save the field and we can see it appears up here. Great, let's move to the article, and this article will have a couple of more fields than the author. So let's start by adding a new field, and let's add the title field first. It will be text and single line string name title, and from the validations I'm gonna set it required and save the field. Next, let's add the author, so add new field, and now we want to actually link to the author model. So we want to select the links and then single link. And from here we can give it a name. So let's call it author. And from the validations, we want to specify a specific model. So right here, we want to only accept only specific models. Click here and we can select the author from here. And let's set it to required also. And then save the field. Next, let's add the cover image we have for blog post. So that will be media and single asset. And let's call it cover image, like this. And then from the validations, we want to set it also required. And then we want to actually accept only specific extensions. So let's click that. And from here, we can select that we only want to accept images like this. Then let's save the field. Then next, let's add the excerpt. So that will be just text and single line text like so. And we want it to be also required. Save the field. So now we have title, author, cover image, and excerpt. Let's check the JavaScript file. So we have title, author, cover image, excerpt. So we still need slug, content, and publish date. So let's add the publish date next. So that will be date and time and a date like this. And we can call it publish date. And from the validations, we want it also to be required. So every blog post must have a published date. And then let's add the slug. So for the slug, we could use just a text and a single line text. But DatoCMS actually offers a special slug field. So if we click the SEO, and from here we can click the slug. Let's name it slug. And from the validations, we can actually select a reference field based on which the slug will be automatically generated. So let's click that and use the title for that. And we want to set it required also. Let's save it. And last one is the content. So let's add that. And as I said earlier in this video, we will use the structured text for the content. So let's select that and name it as content. Then from the validations, we can set it to required. And then there is also this specify the blocks allowed in this field. This is something we will take a look at later on this video. So right now we can leave it as is. And from the presentation tab, we can see different blocks and different formatting that is allowed inside this text field. So if we wanted to disable, for example, some of the formattings or blocks, we could just disable them from here and then save, and users couldn't add those formattings or blocks inside the content. But right now we can allow all of them and then just save the field and it appears down here. Great. So right now we have all the fields for our article ready. But there is still one thing I want to do, and that is to add a new field set. And what these field sets are, they basically enable you to just group different fields inside this model. So it's easier to understand the model and find the fields you are looking for. So when I'm looking these fields, I'm seeing like the slug and publish date fields, for example, are kind of metadata. So what I want to do is add a new field set, call it metadata, save it, and then move the slug and publish fields inside that field set. And I can do it by drag and dropping them like this. So now the model looks a little bit nicer. So right now we kind of have our database structure and schema ready. And the last step we need before we can start using this CMS data inside our Next.js application is to actually add some data inside this CMS. So how we can do that is by going up here to the content tab, and from here we can actually see our models on the left hand side. And let's add an author first. So I'm gonna click it open and create a new record. And right here we can now see all the fields we defined for the given model. So for the author model, we just have the name field. So I'm gonna add a couple of authors right here. Like this. So now we have two authors defined in our CMS. Next, let's add an article. So I'm gonna click the article model and then create a new record. And right here, again, we can see all the fields we defined in the model. So for this, I'm actually gonna copy paste some data from the JS file. So let's say we wanted the tuna salad, for example. So I'm gonna copy the title. Then the author will be this. Then for the cover image, we can upload an image right here. So let's do that. I'm gonna take the image from the public folder and images and the tuna salad cover. You can find these images from the GitHub repo also. Like that, it uploaded it. Then for the excerpt, I'm gonna copy the excerpt from here. And for the content, I'm just gonna type in some dummy content for now. So let's say we wanted the heading, for example. So we can type in slash and it shows all the commands that we can use or all the formattings we can do. So I want to use the heading 1. So let's choose that and let's call it preparation. So the preparation is opening the tuna can. And then we can also type in like this. And if we highlight it, we can see the different formattings popping up. So let's make that bold. Let's roll with this for now. And then we have the publish date. So let's say it's like the 23rd. And right here we can see actually the slug being automatically generated based on the title we added right here. And we can modify this in here if we want, but I'm fine with the automatically generated slug. So let's hit the save button. So right now we can see up here that it says not published. And this is because we checked the box when defining the article model saying that enable the draft published system. So that's why it's not published even though we saved it. And if we open up the API Explorer, from here we can search for all the articles. So I'm gonna click open the Explorer and let's just select all articles and for all articles the title like this. And we can run the query up here and we see that we get no articles as return. And that's because this article is still in draft. So if we click the publish, it is now published. And now if we change back to the API Explorer and run the query, we can see that we get the post as return. Okay, so now we pretty much have the CMS side ready. So we have the models defined, so the database structure is defined, and then we also have some data populated inside of those models. So next we can jump to the code and start modifying our application to use this data from the CMS instead of the data from the JavaScript file. And to do that, let's open up the DatoCMS documentation. So I'm going to go to the front page and from here learn and documentation, and on the left hand side select the Next.js. So DatoCMS actually has a pretty good tutorial and documentation on how to integrate DatoCMS with Next.js. So we are gonna follow this along and implement it to our own application. So the first step is fetching the content from GraphQL API. And we can do the fetching inside either the get server-side props or get static props. And for our application, we want to use the build time rendering, so we will use the get static props function. And to get started, we actually need to install GraphQL request. So let's hop into the Visual Studio Code. I'm gonna close this file, stop the server, and then just install yarn install GraphQL request. And we actually need to also install GraphQL like this. Oh, and it's not install, it's add. Great. Next, we'll create a new file that we will use to handle all the GraphQL requests. So I'm going to create a new file inside the lib folder called DatoCMS.js. And then I'll switch to the blog post and I'm going to copy all this code from here and paste it into our file. And let's save it. So quick explanation what all this does. Basically, we export a request function that we can use to make all the GraphQL requests we need. And with the preview variable, we can actually define the endpoint. So if we want to use the preview endpoint of DatoCMS GraphQL API, we can pass in the preview as true. And what's the difference between these two endpoints is that the preview endpoint also returns all the draft items. Then we create a GraphQL client, which we will pass in headers and the authorization header. And right here, we will use an API token for the GraphQL API. So that's still something we need to define. But other than that, this code is ready to use. So next, let's copy this API token to our project. So I'm going to go to the DatoCMS and to our project over here, then click the settings and from here the API tokens, and we want to use the read-only API token. And it's right here, so I'm gonna click copy and switch back to the Visual Studio Code. And as we can see, we are using this from the environment variables. So in order for this to work, let's add an environment variable file called .env.local. So this file will have all the environment variables in our local project. And as we can see, it's already ignored by Git, so it won't be committed to the Git repo. So all the secrets will remain only locally. And here, let's define the variable. So it was next DatoCMS API token. So next, like this, and equals, and I'm gonna paste in the API key we copied earlier, like this. Let's save it. So now, because we define the variable inside this env local file and we use the prefix next underscore, Next.js will know to include this environment variable inside the bundle. So that's good to go. We can close this. Then let's switch to the index.js. So pages and index.js. And right here, let's import the request function we just defined. Like so. And now let's switch back to the blog post. So if we scroll down a little bit, we can see an example. So we imported the request from the DatoCMS file. Then we still need to define a GraphQL query and then use it inside the getStaticProps function. So I'm just gonna copy all this, switch to the Visual Studio Code and paste it in over here. And I'm gonna delete this query, so it's empty for now. And let's see, so we have the getStaticProps function. Inside of it, we use the request function from DatoCMS, and we pass in as parameters the query, which we will define in a second, and then variables with the variable limit 10. Then we will return an object which has the property props, and inside of there will be the data we fetched from the GraphQL API. And when we are returning the props like this from the getStaticProps function, they are accessible inside the component props. So let's add props over here. And right now we don't need this get all posts anymore, so let's delete that and take the data from the props. So const data equals props, like this. So now we have access to the data from the props. I'll save it and let's just for now log the data like this. And in order for us to fetch any data, we still need to define this homepage query. So for this, I'm actually gonna switch back to the DatoCMS and to the API Explorer. And right here, we can actually define the query we will use. So for this, what we want is all articles, and for the articles we want the information about the author and the author name. Then we want the content and the value of the content like this. Then the cover image, and for the image the URL. Then we need the excerpt, ID, publish date, and the slug. So as we select them in here, we can see the query updating. So let's run this and we can see the result over here. I think that looks good. So right now I'm just gonna copy this and paste it into the query variable like this. Let's save it, and we are now not using any variables right here, so we can actually take this line away. Let's save it and run the server. Looks like we are getting some errors. Okay, post is not defined, and that's okay. That's because we deleted the posts up here. So what we'll need to do is define the posts, and that will be the data.allArticles, like so. And why it's all articles is because right here we are defining it to be all articles. Let's save it and switch back to the browser. So we are getting another error. Image is missing required src property. And that's because our data is now looking a bit different. If we look at the GraphQL API Explorer, we can see that we get the cover image as an object. As before, we got the URL right here in the cover image. So we need to modify the code a little bit. So I'm gonna go down here to the blog post preview component, and instead of calling the data.coverimage, we are calling the data.coverimage.url like this. Let's save it and see what it says. If I switch back to the browser. Okay, so right now the hostname for the images is not defined. And we can fix this error by going into our Next.js config file. And right here we need to define all the domains we want to use images from. So I'm gonna add the DatoCMS assets.com right here. Like this. Now, since we modified Next.js config, we need to restart our server. So let's do that and switch back to the browser. And we are getting another error, which would indicate that we are trying to render an object. So I think this is because we are rendering the author like this, because the author was earlier just the name. So right now the author is an object, as we can see in the API Explorer. If we look at it right here, so the author is an object with the property name. So we need to modify the author right here to have .name. Let's save it, check it out. Okay, so now we get our front page rendered without any errors. And since we only have one blog post in the CMS, it's only showing one blog post. So this looks good. But now that we are fetching the post data from the GraphQL API inside DatoCMS, and we also have our images in DatoCMS, we can use something called responsive image object to display this cover image. Let me show you. I have the DatoCMS docs open. You can find it from this URL. So this responsive image object is something that DatoCMS offers, and this object will have pre-computed image attributes that will help you setting up responsive images in your frontend without any additional manipulation. So that sounds pretty great. And if we take a look at the API Explorer and let's see the cover image right here, we can see that it has this responsive image property over here. So if we click it and we have all the values from there selected, let's run this query. We can right here see the cover image and the responsive image property, and we can see that we get all these different attributes for the image right here in the response. Okay, you might now think that, oh man, I gotta learn how to use all these fancy attributes inside this object. But that's actually not the case, because DatoCMS also offers this React image component that takes this responsive image object as a prop and then handles the display and optimizes the image loading. So all we need to do is to pass the responsive image object as a prop for the DatoCMS image component, and we are good to go. So let's modify the blog post preview component to use the responsive image object and the DatoCMS image component right here. So first, let's switch to the Visual Studio Code and modify the query we have. So right now we had the URL for the cover image, and we don't actually need it anymore. And let's copy the query from the API Explorer. So we have the cover image and the responsive image right here. So I'm gonna copy this and paste it inside the cover image right here. And next we need to install the image component, and it was in the React-DatoCMS package. So let's add that. Once that's run, let's import it like this, and we can remove the earlier image import and also this get all post import. Then we still need to modify the blog post preview component to use that image component. Let's take that away. So let's add the image, and now what we need to pass for the image is only a data prop that equals to the responsive image property. So let's add that. Like this. Now let's save this and start our server. Let's switch back to the browser, and as we can see, it looks like nothing changed, but if we refresh the page, so I'm gonna refresh now, we actually see that the image component automatically implemented this blur effect for the image while the image was loading. And we didn't have to do any configuration or that kind of stuff. Only thing we did was pass in the responsive image object to the image component, and that was it. It works. So that's pretty cool. So right now we have the front page working and using the CMS. So let's move to the actual blog post page. So let's open up this blog post. And right now this is showing the old data from the JS file. So we need to modify this to fetch the data from DatoCMS. So let's start by going into the Visual Studio Code and opening up the blog post page. And right here, let's start by modifying this getStaticPaths function. So what this function does, it returns all the possible paths for the blog posts. So right here, we want to fetch all the possible slugs from the CMS and then return them in the paths array. So let's do that. So first, let's define the query. And for this, I'm gonna open up the API Explorer and let's build the query in here. So for this, I don't need any of this and that. Only thing we actually want is the slug, like this. So if I run this, it returns all articles array with objects, and the objects have the slug value. So I'll copy this query and paste it in to the Visual Studio Code. Next, we need to import the request function. So let's do that. And then inside the function actually execute the query. So I'm gonna actually paste in the code inside here and we'll go through it line by line. So I'm gonna take this away and paste it in. So right here we make the query with the request function with the paths query. Then we define a paths array and loop through all the results, returning the /block/ the slug inside the array. And then return the paths like so. So that should be okay like that. Then next, let's modify the getStaticProps function to fetch the data from the GraphQL API. So I'm gonna again first define the query. And again, I'm gonna switch to the API Explorer and let's see what information we want. So right now we don't want all the articles, but we want an article. So let's select the article And for that article, we want the author information, the name of the author, then the content and the value, the cover image, and for the cover image again we will use the DatoCMS image component, so we want the responsive image object and these variables over here. Then we still need the ID, publish date, slug and title for the blog post. So let's run this query and see that we get the results correctly. Looks good, but we still need to implement some filtering in here. So inside our code, we want to get an article by its slug. So we need to add some filtering in here. Right now we have only one article here, so it returns the correct one. But when we have more, we need the filtering. So we can select up here the filter and then the slug equals and then whatever we want it to be. So let's just add right now the slug tuna salad and run it, and it returns the correct one. If we modify this to something that's not found, let's try it, it returns a null. So it's working. So now I'm gonna copy this query, paste it in to the article query. And as we see, we don't want to use this static value tuna salad for this, but we want this to be the slug. So let's modify this still a little bit. So I'm gonna take the tuna salad away. And in order to add a variable for this query, we can use the $sign and the variable name. So I'm gonna use slug like this. Then again, I'm gonna remove all this code and paste in some code and then explain it. Okay, so right here we are fetching the actual post with the request function with the query of the article query defined up here. Then we pass in variables, and right here is the part where we pass in the slug variable, so the filtering we implemented up here works. Because we used the slug over here, we want to pass in variables with slug, and the slug equals the params.slug. So we get the slug value from the params variable. Then we return an object with props, and we name the prop we want to use post data, and it equals the post.article. So from here, the article variable, and that's because we defined it right here. Okay, so let's save this. Looks like we are getting some errors. If we switch back to the browser, we can see them a bit better. So looks like we forgot to make these functions asynchronous. So let's do that. So getStaticProps is a sync function. And because we used the await keyword here, we need to define the functions as sync. So let's modify the getStaticPaths also. Let's save it. Okay, looks like we get another error. Oh yeah, we still need to define that variable inside here. So let's add that. So it's a string, like so. Now let's save it, switch back to the browser and refresh the page. Okay, we are getting error about the image, and as we did with the cover image in the front page, we want to actually use the DatoCMS image component. So I'm gonna, instead of importing the image from there, we are going to import it from the DatoCMS package, like so. And we can actually delete that, it's not used anymore. Only thing left is to actually modify the image component, pass in the data prop, which was the responsive image property, like so. Let's save it, switch back to the browser. Okay, oh yeah, we need to import it like this. Let's try it now, and we are getting the same error we got with the author in the front page. So let's modify that. So it was the postdata.author.name that we want to show right here. Let's save it, and we are still getting the error, and I think this is because of the content now, because we get the content as an object right now. So let's, for the time being, comment this out and save it and see if we can get the blog post displayed. All right, looks like it's working. So we have the title, publish date, author, and then the image up here with the blur effect as we saw just now. Okay, so only thing missing is the content. And as I said earlier, we are gonna use the structured text for the content. And if we look at the content inside the API Explorer, and we can see that the content is actually an object with the property value, and there is a bunch of stuff inside of it. So the good news for this is that in order to display this, all we need to do is use the structured text component from the DatoCMS React package. So since we already have the image component used from there, we don't have to install it. We can just import the structured text component. So right here, let's import structured text. And here where the content is, I'm gonna remove that and just use the structured text with the prop data equals the postdata.content.value, like this. Let's save it, switch back to the browser, and the content is displayed as we formatted it in the CMS editor. So that's pretty cool. It just works out of the box, and we didn't have to configure it in any way. So right now we have the blog post page displaying the contents of our blog post from the CMS. So just to test this a bit more, let's actually add a new blog post to our CMS. So I'm gonna go to the content page, and let's actually make a new post with images in the content. So in order to do this, we need to first add a new block definition that specifies an image type of block, and then we need to also tell to the structured text component inside our code how to render that type of special block. So that might sound a little bit complicated, but it actually isn't. It's pretty straightforward, and I will show you how to do that. So let's actually go to the settings page, and we first need to define the block. So we will open up the blocks library, and then let's add a new block. And I'm gonna name this block as an image and save it. And now, pretty much as we did with models, we can add fields to this block. So I'm gonna add a new field, and because I want it to have images, I'm gonna select media and single asset, and I'll name this as image as well. And from the validations, I'm gonna set the required true, and then only allow images to be uploaded, like this. Then save the field, and we have our block created. Next, we still need to tell the structured text that it can allow these image type of blocks. So I'm gonna open up the models and the article model, and from here I'll take the content field and edit it, and from the validations tab we will modify this, so specify the blocks allowed in this field. So right here we can see our image block appearing here, so let's select it. So right now we are defining that, okay, this field, the content field, is allowed to have these image blocks inside of it. And let's save that. And now we are ready to create a post with images inside the content. So let's do that. So I'm gonna go to the content page, create a new record, and I'm gonna actually copy some data from the posts.js as we did earlier. So let's use the chicken soup. The author is that, and then the cover image, I'm gonna upload the chicken soup cover, and for the excerpt I'll just copy the value from here, and then for the content we can just add some text, for example like this. And right now let's add an image of the finished dish down here, and in order to do that all we need to do is type in slash, and earlier we only had these other values in here or other options, but now since we defined that this content can also have these image blocks, we see the image right here. So we can click that and we get this view over here, and we can upload the image from here. So let's do that. So I have this example image over here, I'll select that, and now it's uploaded. Then let's add some metadata. So let's say this was published, and then this slug can be that. Okay, great. Let's save this, And now if we refresh the front page of our application, we still see that we don't get that blog post here. And that's again because we didn't publish it, so we still need to publish it. Now if we refresh the page, we see the new blog post opening up here. Okay, great. Let's click the blog post open. And right now we are getting an error saying that structured text document contains a block node, but no renderBlock prop is specified. So as I said earlier, we still need to tell that structured text component how to render this image kind of block. So let's open up the blog post we looked earlier about the Next.js, and from here let's select the structured text fields. And if we go a little bit down, we can see this heading rendering special nodes. So since we have a block node inside our content right now, we need to specify how to render it. So right here we see an example. If we have a render block, and this is actually for an image also. So I'm gonna actually copy this and let's modify it in VS Code. So for the structured text, I'll add that. And then let's switch back to the blog post and let's see, we still need to modify the query to have all the block information in it. So how we can do that is for the content, we need to also fetch the blocks object and the type name, and depending on the type name, the corresponding values. So I'm gonna copy this from here to the API Explorer. So right now we have the article query open here. So let's see the content. So right here, I'm gonna paste in this blocks, and right now it's saying that we don't have image block record, and that's because our block was called image. So we can access it with image record like that. And for the block, we want the ID, and for the image, we actually don't want these because we are gonna use that DatoCMS image component. So we want the responsive image object. So we can actually copy this one down here over here like this. Let's run this to see if it works. Looks like it's working, but right now we are fetching the tuna salad blog post and it didn't have any images in the content. So let's change this to the chicken soup and run it. So now when we check the value of the content, we can see that we also get these blocks with the type name image record, and then there is all the image information down there. So looks like this query is working. So just to recap, for the content we also now want the blocks because there can be special blocks, and what this basically means is that when the type name is image record, then fetch all this. Okay, so let's just copy this content part of the query and paste it in to the query in Visual Studio Code. So we have the content, so I'm gonna replace that with the new query like this. So now our query should be okay, but we still need to modify the structured text render block. And what we need to do is, instead of checking for the image block, we want to check for the image record, as it was our block's name. And then instead of using the HTML image element, we want to use the DatoCMS image component. So I'll add that. So image and data is the record.image.responsive image like this. Now let's save this and switch back to the browser and hope for the best. And looks like we get an error still. Oh yeah, so instead of passing the value as a prop, as a data prop, we just want to pass in the content, because right now if we check the API Explorer, we are getting the value and then also the blocks. So we need this information to be passed for the component too. If we change it to content and save it, okay, now our page is rendering. If we refresh it, it looks good. It has the blur effect for the images and everything seems to be working. It's safe to say that our blog posts are displaying correctly and it's fetching the data from the CMS. So there is still one thing I should point out about adding new blog posts. So now if you add a new blog post to the CMS and you open your app in the development mode, you will see the blog post right there. And this is because Next.js in development mode rebuilds the site on every request. But this is not the case in production. So if you deploy this to production, what will happen is that the site will be built in build time because we use the getStaticProps functions to fetch the data. So this is run in build time. So if you added a new article to the CMS, it wouldn't be visible in your production website until you rebuild the site. But the good news is that we can set up something called build triggers very easily inside DatoCMS. So you can just build your site from there. So I'm going to open up the settings page and show you how to actually set up a build trigger with Vercel, so you can build your site right here from DatoCMS. So if we go down here, we can find the build triggers, and let's create a new one. So click over here, and I'm going to be using Vercel. So if you have your application deployed to Vercel, you can link it from here. And if you want to learn how to deploy your application to Vercel, I have a video about it. You can check it up somewhere up there or in the link in the description. So we won't show it here, but when you have your application deployed to Vercel, you can select it from here. It creates a new build trigger and we can give it a name. Let's say Vercel, and I'm gonna leave these like so. Then let's link this to a Vercel project. Let's click here, and we need to add the DatoCMS integration. Let's do that. And from here we can select the project we want to link this to. So I have my Cooking with Tuomo repo over there. Let's select that, and which branch we want to deploy from. We want to use the main, so that's okay. Let's continue and save settings like this. So now we have a build trigger set up, and we can see that we got this build status button up here, and if we click it, we can deploy this application straight to Vercel from here. So let's try and build it now. So I click that and it says build in progress, and let's wait it to finish. We can also open up the activity log from the left hand side to see the progress. Okay, it was successful, so it's working. So now whenever we add new content to the CMS, for example add a new blog post or new article, after publishing it we still need to build the site, and we can do it right up here and build now. And after that it will build the site and it will be available with the new content. If you found this video helpful, please do leave a like and hit the subscribe button below. I also have a Next.js playlist that has a lot of videos teaching you more about Next.js. You can right now view it directly by clicking from here.